Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we're continuing the plot to seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is chapter 2 of part 2. Commissioned a first lieutenant on April 8th, 1899, Butler left 4 days later with a battalion of 300 Marines bound for the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo had begun a revolution against American occupation of the islands following Spain's surrender. He led his company at the head of a battalion attack on Localeta, a fiercely defended rebel stronghold that the Spaniards had never been able to take. Stumbling onto concealed trenches and rifle pits, his company met with a blanket of heavy fire. The men went prone, waiting for his orders. Desperation overcoming fright, Butler sprang to his feet, waving the company to charge and open fire. The battle drove the insurgents back from the trench. He pursued them through waist-high rice paddies until they turned and fled. He grew increasingly confident of his ability to survive. After several more skirmishes had driven down the Aguinaldo forces north of the mountain strongholds, his pride in the Corps kept growing. When a Japanese tattooist turned up to the Navy Yard at Cavite, he had an enormous Marine Corps emblem tattooed across his chest. Infection from the tattooist needle brought him down with raging fever. In June 1900, he was ordered to a new Asian outpost of trouble under Major John Littleton Tazewell Waller, a crusty bantam of a man with a fierce mustache. The Marines sailed for China to rescue the American legation, which had been imperiled by the Boxer uprising. The expedition numbered only 100 Marines, but by the time they arrived in China, the situation had reached crisis proportions. All of North China was now up in arms against the foreign powers who had carved the country into colonial spheres of influence. The Chinese bitterly resented the alien flags that flew over the imperialist compounds and foreign ships that dominated Chinese ports, flooding the country with Western goods. Most infuriating of all were the entrance signs to the foreign legations had posted at their luxurious clubs, forbidden to dogs and Chinese. Eventually, the Allied nations had to send over 100,000 troops to protect their nationals. The 18-year-old Butler, who had no understanding of the political causes of the Boxer Rebellion, saw his role simply as that of a Marine doing his duty to protect American citizens on foreign soil. Waller received word that the legation compound at Tientsin, 25 miles inland, was in desperate straits. A small defending force of Allied soldiers was trying to hold off 50,000 attacking Boxers. Waller, Butler, and their 98 men were joined by a column of 400 Russians, also en route to relieve the siege. At a gray mud village later known as Boxertown, bursts of heavy fire exploded from the trenches on all sides. The Russians, who received the brunt of it, fell back swiftly through the lines of the Marines. Waller's men flattened on the plain, returning the fire. 3 Marines were killed, 9 wounded. Ordered to withdraw, Butler counted noses and found a private named Carter missing. When a lieutenant named Harding and 4 privates, with a lieutenant named Harding and 4 privates, he ran a gauntlet of fire to search for him. Locating Carter in a ditch, Butler found that his leg had been broken. While the 4 privates fought off Boxers, Butler and Harding removed their shirts to bandage Carter's legs together, carrying him off between them. It took them an excruciating 4 hours to fight 7 miles through the wine of persistent bullets to catch up with the company. Tripped several times by his sword, Butler unbuckled it in exasperation and flung it away. During their weary retreat of the Marines, Butler constantly fought off an urge to collapse and give himself over to sleep or death, not caring too much which. Suddenly, the crack of a bullet was followed by a dull sound right next to him. Startled, he looked up to see a stream of blood flowing down the face of a grizzled sergeant. The veteran Marine made no sound, just scowled, put his hat over the wound, and continued the pace of the march. It was an image of tough Marine courage that engraved itself on Butler's memory. Stumbling on through a fierce North China dust storm with a raging toothache, his heels rubbed raw by marches that began at 2:30 a.m., famished by hunger, Butler was so miserable that boxer gun fire seemed the mildest of his torments. Finally, the Marines joined forces with a newly arrived column of 3,000 international troops and fought their way through to the Tientsin compound. Routing a Chinese cohort, they broke the siege as overjoyed women and children rushed out to hug their rescuers. The international troops defending the Tientsin compound were soon reinforced by an allied army of 7,000 men. On July 13th, 1900, they attacked the native walled city of Tientsin to rout the Boxers from their stronghold. Butler was in the forefront of the assault, which required breaking through an outer mud wall 20 feet high and crossing 1,500 yards of rice paddies to an inner high stone wall. Leading his company through a hail of Chinese shells and sniper bullets, he climbed over the mud wall, only to find himself dropping into a moat. The Chinese had flooded the paddies between the walls. He and his men splashed through the morass, slipping and lurching in waist-high muck until they sought to fire their weapons. When they approached the inner wall gate, thousands of Chinese on the wall poured down a withering fire, forcing Butler to order a retreat. A tall private next to him, named Partridge, was hit and seriously wounded. Butler and two Marines carried him above water level through the rain of bullets splashing around them. A burning sensation in his right thigh puzzled Butler momentarily until he realized he had been shot. Ignoring his wound, he continued to help carry Partridge until they reached some high ground. There he applied first aid to the private's wounds, then limped off in search of a medic for him. By the time he found a Marine doctor, blood was pouring copiously out of his own wound. He protested volubly when the doctor, who outranked him, insisted on treating him first. By the time he got the doctor back to Partridge, the private was dead. Grieved and angry, he refused to leave when the doctor ordered him to the rear with the other wounded. His first lieutenant, Henry Leonard, and a sergeant insisted on dragging him off to the other side of the mud wall. Here he was joined by a Marine lieutenant who had been wounded in the left leg. Tying their disabled legs together, they hobbled three-legged back to the nearest first aid station. When they had been treated and bandaged, they helped dress the wounds of hundreds of other casualties now pouring in. Recommending Butler for promotion, Major Waller declared, "I have before mentioned the fine qualities of Mr. Butler in control of men, courage, and excellent example in his own person of all the qualities most admirable in a soldier." On July 23, 1900, a week before he turned 19, Butler was made captain while recuperating in the hospital. The enlisted men who had helped him rescue Private Carter at Boxertown received medals of honor, which, until 1914, were not awarded to officers. But Butler's promotion took cognizance of his heroism, citing his, quote, distinguished conduct in public service in the presence of the enemy, end quote. Insisting that his leg was fully healed, he painfully concealed the limp until he had nagged the doctors into getting rid of him with a hospital discharge so that he could lead his men on a march to relieve the siege of Peking. They were part of a large, colorful international army that included French zouaves in red and blue, Italian bersaglieri with plumed helmets, Royal Welsh Fusiliers with ribbons down their napes, Bengal cavalry on Arab stallions, turbaned Sikhs, Germans in pointed helmets, and flamboyantly uniformed troops of half a dozen other countries. Butler's leg wound throbbed painfully, and he suffered spells of sickness from polluted water and food. His stomach was not soothed by sights en route to Peking. 2 Japanese soldiers, eyes and tongues cut out, nailed to a door. An old Chinese mandarin pinned to his bed by a huge sword. Village streets strewn with fly-covered corpses, their skulls smashed in. The Boxers were just as ruthless with Chinese traitors as they were with luckless foreigners. In one village, a Chinese family, frightened by the Allied army's approach, jumped into a canal and tried to drown themselves. Butler and his men rescued them and pinioned them firmly while an interpreter explained that the troops would not harm them. After some animated conversation, the interpreter told him, "Captain, these people say that since you have saved their lives, you are responsible for them as guardians and must now take care of them." "Goodbye," yelled Butler, racing off with his men. Reaching the outskirts of Peking, they ran into blistering fire from the top of the city's stone and mud wall. They joined a combined 5,000-man army, American and British force, hastily digging a trench before the city. One British private left the trench in an attempt to wipe out a Chinese strongpoint at one gate, but was hit between the trench and the wall. Butler's friend, Henry Leonard, sped out to rescue him, but was shot and badly wounded. Clearing the trench at a bound, Butler raced through fire to reach him, but Leonard proved able to scramble back on his own, so Butler lifted the wounded Tommy on his back instead and staggered back to the trench with him. Just as he eased the British soldier over the parapet, a stunning blow hit him in the chest. Whirling and falling, he lost consciousness briefly. When he recovered, he heard one Marine say he'd been shot through the heart. He tried to speak, but he found that he had no breath to vocalize. His shirt was torn open, and it was discovered that a bullet had struck the second button of his military blouse, flattening it and driving it into his chest. The button had gouged a hole in the eagle of the Marine Corps emblem he had tattooed on his chest in the Philippines. The wound was not serious, although for weeks afterward, his bruised chest ached painfully, and he spat blood when he coughed. He was later congratulated by General A.R.R. Dorward, commanding general of the British contingent, who called Butler's rescue of the wounded Tommy the bravest act he'd ever seen on the battlefield and recommended him for the Victoria Cross. But the American government in those days did not permit an American officer to accept foreign decorations of any kind. By August 14th, Peking was in the hands of the Allies, and the Boxer Rebellion was crushed. Butler's company of Marines, the longest in China, had suffered the greatest casualties in the fighting, 26 killed or wounded. Exhausted, Butler now came down with a bad case of typhoid fever that wasted his already spare frame down to a skeletonized 90 pounds.